Hi, everyone. My name is Andy Tang. It's great to meet you all. I understand this is a virtual forum that is being shown in Silicon Valley, Austin, Texas, and also just globally. And I would love to talk to some of the entrepreneurs and some of the professional investors, especially early stage investors out there that's supporting the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So today I wanted to share with you some of my experience just working as a practitioner in the venture capital industry as an institutional investor for the last 2 decades. So I actually started my investment career right here in Silicon Valley to manage the Siemens Ventures fund in the early 2000s, and then team up with Tim Draper and my Chinese partner to start our Asia fund based in Shanghai, where I spent last 5 years. And then my family and I came back in 2010. And then, I rejoined Tim and we launched the Draper Associates and Draper University and the whole Draper ecosystem. So my experience is really coming from, supporting entrepreneurs at different stages of their journey. Capital is only being one of them. And also I like to think, you know, when I first started investing 2 decades ago, the landscape and the need and the wants of the entrepreneurs are very different from what they need today, right? So I'll give you a quick flashback. 20 years ago, entrepreneurs actually have it really tough, right? There weren't nearly as many investors or angels, right? There were definitely no accelerators. And a lot of the schools, academia, they also didn't have a lot of support for you. But today, I find that being an entrepreneur, while it's more competitive than the past, right? 20 years ago, there isn't as much sort of this hyper competitive level around the globe. The competitive landscape in the world has really been flattened, right? These days, I see a good idea that starts from anywhere in the world. I'll pay attention to it, right? 10, 15 years ago, I don't even see these global ideas, right? You got to be in part of the innovation center, and otherwise you won't be noticed or be discovered. And investors tend to do investments in our own neighborhood. But today, what I find is that investors are a lot more global. We look everywhere, right? And that flattening of the landscape or the internationalization of entrepreneurship and venture capital really got accelerated during COVID, right? I don't need to tell you, even 2 years ago, for me to speak to the F50 audience, typically it's an in-person meeting. I would never imagine we would do a talk virtually over Zoom or over recording. But that's great, right? I look at the various industries that venture capital transformed. We started with communication, telecom, commerce, um, corporate productivity, media, entertainment, uh, industrial, and most recently, financial services. You can see these are the industries that have been transformed the last 20 years in that order, right? First started with communication and then commerce, and then corporate productivity, enterprise software, and then most recently, the industrial and then the fintech companies came. You can think of this as a continuum. There's just more and more regulation for each one of these industries. So if the industry has a lot of regulation, it takes longer to be disrupted. There are three industries that haven't been disrupted, and that's education, healthcare, and government, right? In a way, the conference industry, what I'm talking to you now, is an education industry, right? It's about learning, it's about networking. So this particular industry that we're in now, in the last 18 months, it completely got transformed, right? Suddenly there's no need for me to go to a conference, for you to come to a conference and listen to me. There's also no need for us to schedule a time so we can meet together. There's also no need for you to try to pay attention to me, uninterrupted for the duration of the talk. Now you could play back at your own pace, you could rewind. I don't think I'm saying anything that's difficult to understand, so hopefully there's not a lot of rewinding, right? But that's just one small example of how COVID, such a tragic human event, but it actually accelerated a lot of the industries, one of which happened to be the conference or education, right? So in my mind, um, being an entrepreneur today and being a venture capitalist or investor today compared to even a year and a half ago, it's completely different, right? People are a lot more willing to fund companies that may not be in your immediate neighborhood, right? So, and I think this is good for humanity, right? This idea of, hey, if I want to create a startup company, I got to be in Silicon Valley, or I want to create the next optical component company, I have to be. If I didn't work for AT&T Bell Labs or IBM Watson or didn't go to Stanford, I can't get funded because I'm not. I don't even have the right paper to read. I don't have the right peers to talk to, and for sure, I don't have investors around me. Now that paradigm has shifted. It started to shift very slowly last 20 years, but COVID completely gave it a step function transformation, right? So this is really has made our market a lot more efficient. The pairing of entrepreneurs with investors now transcends the border. Okay, it transcends border. Now you still look at Silicon Valley probably accounts for a third of all venture capital in the world. I don't forget it's a third, 40%, huge number. And I expect that number to continue going down, right? And it's very natural. Where does it go next, right? So we've seen many centers around the US, around the globe popping up, right? I mentioned I worked in China for 5 years. Beijing is a huge venture capital center, Shanghai, huge center. And we see now within the US, Austin, Texas, where I spent 4 years from my undergrad, absolutely wonderful place for people to live, go to school, starting a new business. Now, previously in the last, 40, 50 years, a lot of the talent have gone into industries such as oil and gas, industrial automation, and they've really served society well, right? As that industry plateau and maybe potentially decline, a lot of these talent are beginning to look at where else can I go to contribute to, humanity and societal transformation, right? I mentioned, healthcare, education, government. So these are places I'm seeing, new talents sort of moving into, right? And as COVID sort of brought all of us to a new mindset where we can work from anywhere, we could collaborate with anybody, right? I spend a lot of time looking at two industries, that's healthcare and financial services. And within financial services, I spend quite a bit of time looking at crypto. Crypto is one industry where you probably have the fastest moving companies. Some of these companies don't even incorporate. They go straight to a token structure, right? They could access liquidity, access capital, hire people, compensate people, forming teams dynamically, right? Forget employment contract, right? So some of these people may just be on project based, maybe just one day work on this or half day work on that. You don't really have one employer, you have multiple startups you work with. So as an investor, I'm really trying to adapt to this new entrepreneur environment. Now you're going to say, oh yeah, some of this is fad. Some of this is a little bit far-fetched. How do you retain talent? How do you deal with conflict? How do you deal with intellectual property? Oh, there are a lot of problems for sure, right? But what I tell you is that if one of these two things work, it really changes the way people start business, right? So crypto, for example, we looked at a lot of projects across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, going down to Latin America, going down to Africa. And some of these teams are completely little United Nation. You have a developer in Latin America, and then a BD person in the US, and then you may have finance that is getting done in Canada. You have these are completely, some of these are even completely online relationships they have never met, right? And these projects could be very fast paced. Instead of a 10-year long project going from incorporation to IPO, you may be looking at a development cycle of 6 months, and then another 6 months of exit, or another 6 months of adoption, commercialization, and then another year of exit. So a total project timeline of 2 years, right? We've seen all kinds of things. And it makes me realize that this idea of entrepreneurship, it really used to be a very specialized profession. Venture capital, also a somewhat specialized silo 10, 20 years ago. But today, it really has become mainstream, right? I also use this mother-in-law example with some of our portfolio CEOs. And I said, 15 years ago, when I first went to China to do venture capital, many people asked me, what were some of the challenges? I said the biggest challenge in China, it wasn't the lack of capital, wasn't the lack of talent, right? It wasn't because, BAT weren't quite as dominant. So it wasn't because BAT was trying to squeeze out the startup. It really was the talent, the engineers' family not understanding startup. So they won't let the young engineers join our startups, right? We have the hardest time convincing the Chinese mother-in-law to let the young son-in-law joining a startup company, because she thinks, well, why are you not working with IBM? Why would you give up an offer to work for IBM and work for this startup that I never heard of, right? But these days, the table has turned. You talk to the Chinese engineers, the mother-in-laws are so sophisticated. They say, show me the cap table. Don't just tell me you got 100,000 shares. What if there are 1 billion shares and 100,000 shares in a 1 billion share company is somewhat worthless? Well, she's so smart, right? So entrepreneurship has become mainstream, right? I'll give you another example. Even when I graduated school, that was a long time ago, very long time ago, right? But there were computers back then. There were computers, but no cell phones. As an engineer graduated from the University of Texas, right? Or even 2 years later, when I graduated from MIT for a master's, I go recruit, right? I fill out my recruiting interview list. On that list, guess what kind of companies were there? At University of Texas, there were 100% publicly traded semiconductor companies or high-tech companies. That's all my options were. When I went to MIT, it was about half tech companies, all publicly traded. Maybe 1 or 2 startup, right? Certainly not 10, right? 1 or 2 out of 50, right? And then guess what? The other ones were financial services. Would you like to work as a trader? Would you like to work as a investment banker or consultant? Right? They just want to hire the smartest people. So those were our options. Today, the table turned, right? It's okay if your school is not on one of these, key university partners, right? My first job out of school was working for Intel. Intel has 20 schools they recruit from, and that's it. If you're not part of that, if you didn't go to school as an entrepreneur, as an engineering student, one of these 20 schools, you can't get into the tech industry. That's just by logistics. Today, the table has completely turned. Well, I say maybe some of these larger tech companies are still kind of set in their ways using recruiters for the top 200, maybe top 100. But certainly for the startup companies, we recruit everywhere and anywhere, right? People get jobs from Twitter, direct message. They use social media. The world truly has become a better place, more efficient, right? I think we as an industry have been eating our own dog food. We use social media for recruiting. We use social media for credit checks, for employee background checks. We really use our products, right? So my prediction, and I like to give you um, three three predictions as a venture capitalist as we part. One prediction is that uh, whatever you're working on, right? So this is not the kind of prediction I'm going to say the Dow is going to go to, 100,000. This is the kind of prediction that's specific to you, right? You as an entrepreneur or you as an angel investor. The first thing is uh, whatever the whatever the decision you're trying to make now as far as startup investing your career in something or investing money in the project, the outcome of the project that you're looking at, if successful, is probably bigger than you could currently imagine, right? Most of us look at a project, we look at only downside. We see what could go wrong, right? So I want you to look at it from a different angle and say, how big could it be? And most of us probably underestimate how big it will be, okay? That's prediction number one. Prediction number two, the project you're looking at will probably take longer than you think it will take. Most of us are pseudo related with startup, whether you're doing a startup, funding a startup, advising a startup, right? We're optimists by nature, which is great. Like, keep up that optimism, right? Because society needs you, especially in this kind of pandemic timeframe, right? But that works against you when you think about how long it takes for something to happen. Okay. Lastly, when it rains, it pours. That's a third prediction, right? Oftentimes we don't know when that adoption takes place, right? But usually when it does, it's faster than you think. Okay. It's almost like if you study military and history, a lot of times when there is a revolution or a war, there's a tipping point, right? So in math, we call it a step function. That tipping point, when it happens a lot faster than you think, right? We were very privileged to have been the first institutional investor in companies such as, uh, Robinhood, Coinbase, Carta, most recently, and then countless number of other ones even before that, such as Baidu, Skype. What we learned is that it takes a while to get going, but oftentimes that virality, when it takes off, it's a step function, it switches, right? So the prediction number 3 and number 2 are somewhat related. Number 3 and number 1 are somewhat related. When it does make that switch, man, it's bigger than you could imagine, right? Bigger than you could imagine, right? So I want you to start thinking big, right? And lastly, what I want to share is that while the geographic border at this point in time is falling, and the world is becoming a sort of a very virtual place. I do think, I sort of have a kind of a Eastern or a Buddhist mentality that when the things are going really well, don't get overly excited. When the things are getting bad, don't get overly pessimistic, right? So right now we're switching to this virtual train. Everything looks great. Everything's virtual, great. We don't need to meet another human being for the rest of our lives, right? That's the conclusion everybody gets. Short real estate, But what I think will happen is that this is going to be a pendulum sort of swing the other way, where you would actually value some face-to-face interaction. Just as we started this conversation, I said, hey, this virtual conference is great. I was in Miami over the weekend for the Bitcoin conference. I realized something. People want to see other people, right? So I think the most successful company would take this lesson to provide flexibility for the employees and startups to have a flexible structure that's very nimble and could organize quickly. But at the same time, we don't lose our roots of humans being social animals, right? The most interesting and the best ideas oftentimes do come in a social setting where you have trust between coworkers and partners, and brainstorm and come up with something that you normally wouldn't come up, right? And those are the interesting ideas that will probably set this next generation of unicorns or decacorns aside, right? So with that, I'm really happy I get a chance to talk to this three very distinguished groups of partners in Silicon Valley, where I live and work, my stomping ground, and Austin, I view home, and I see an awesome tech hub forming. And just a plug for our entities there, we have been in Austin for the last 2 years now. We have our Austin Draper Startup House, and I also have my partners, Matt Harris and his team in Austin. And obviously, globally, Draper Venture Network, we have 23 funds around the world that covers all continents, from 2 funds in Europe, 2 in India, our Draper Dragon fund in China, which I co-founded. I'm still very actively involved with. And we have a fund in Australia and Africa. So we are as global as it gets, and we have been a global fund for the last 20 years. And we're just excited about this new chapter of venture capital entrepreneurship and the transformation of these industries. And I look forward to see you in real life one of these days. Thanks for your time. Take care.